Zelensky Bad News. Putin expresses anxiety over Wagner Group and Prigozhin's possible threats to his safety. The latest report from the Institute for the Study of War claims that Russian dictator Vladimir Putin made several significant symbolic gestures during his meeting with Alexander Lukashenko on July 23. Putin took Lukashenko to Kronstadt, a historical landmark in St. Petersburg and the site of an important anti-Bolshevik insurrection by Russian soldiers and sailors in early 1921 that was put down by the Soviet government. The institute concluded that Putin sought to project power and confidence in his own supremacy at the meeting with the St. Petersburg-based faction aligned with Yevgeny Prigozhin. Putin, Lukashenko, St. Petersburg Governor Alexander Beglov, and Ksenia Shoigu, the younger daughter of Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, toured Kronstadt. According to the ISW, Putin's meeting with Shoigu's daughter and Beglov at the site of the failed Kronstadt rebellion was meant to send a message that Putin and his loyalist cadre had defeated Prigozhin's armed rebellion and Prigozhin's supporters in St. Petersburg. In addition, Putin went out of his way to take photographs with large groups of local Russian citizens, including children, while in Kronstadt, as noted by experts, likely to present himself as a popular and beloved leader among the Russian people. Putin's concern about his perceived popularity, the security of his regime, and the array of factions competing for power within the high echelons of Russian governance, is reflected in these symbolic moves, according to the ISW's analysis. If Russia loses control over Ukraine, it will be impossible for Russians to maintain their myth of Russia. Russia's War is the title of your book, not Putin's war as many in the West tend to think of it. You investigate common Russians' part in the invasion of Ukraine. I was wondering what you hope to accomplish by delving into this area in your book. It's Jade McGlynn. In response to this question, there are two things I'd like to stress. One is that Putin is not acting alone in his aggression towards Ukraine. And if we, the Westerners, think ending the catastrophic genocidal war will be as simple as eliminating one person, we will make the wrong assumptions and come up with the wrong policies. The second is that we must examine the propaganda in order to know what kind of war the Russians are witnessing. The claim that war supporters have been zombified bothers me. It's completely illogical. Of the top 30 political channels, 24 are extremely pro-war, despite the fact that there are 60 million daily users of Telegram, social media, who have access to all channels, including oppositional ones. I wrote this book to argue that the Kremlin's propaganda is effective not just because it has a forum. While it's true that the media system is biased in favor of stories that support the war effort, it's not enough to simply have stories about the war. The narratives are, first and foremost, an exercise in interpretation. They should make sense and resonate with people's understandings of their own lives, the world, being Russian, Russia's history and international role, and, of course, Ukraine and the West. And that's why it's so effective as propaganda. Sias. You discuss the reaction of some members of Russia's liberal opposition to the aggression. In general, what do you think they think about Russia's war in Ukraine? McGlynn. One of the first things to say is that it's tough to generalize about the Russian liberal opposition because they are so disjointed. The women's anti-war movement is one such group, and I admire them tremendously. Their efforts are truly remarkable. They appear to get the tragedy that has led to this war. However, there are those who are not as enthusiastic, including some of Alexei Navalny's team members. They omit Ukraine almost entirely from the story. That was another takeaway from my study. The Navalny Telegram channel made far fewer references to Ukraine than most other Russian Telegram channels did in the first 3 months after the invasion. Ukraine's lines of communication were cut off or they attempted to intervene in the conflict. In March 2022, the opposition attempted to use the Western government's negotiations with the Kremlin over Ukraine to demand that the Kremlin release Navalny from prison. Navalny's case cannot be inserted into such discussions on Ukraine, as much as I would like to see him released, as someone who should not have been imprisoned in the first place. By mirroring the Kremlin's denial of Ukrainian agency, some members of Russia's democratic opposition display Ukrainophobia, solipsism, and a certain degree of self-obsession. They always claim to be Ukraine's friends, but that's not always the case. Even more so, it is deeply offensive to see some people vehemently reject Ukrainian criticism with lines like, "Oh, well, you must be Putin bots because you are fighting us and we are anti-Putin." However, Ukrainians are actively engaged in battle. Despite this, I feel no need to criticize Russia's opposition. They are not a unified front, and many individuals have given a great deal to try to bring down Putin's government. In Putin's Russia, I doubt I would have the guts to demonstrate. If I were Ukrainian, I doubt I'd have even a fraction of their courage. This is more about giving some members of the Russian opposition some perspective. Their hardships, however severe, pale in comparison to what the Ukrainian people are going through right now. Sias. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, you have been keeping up with Russian media's narratives. Is it true that newspapers and TV stations outside of the capital rarely cover the war? Just how do you account for this? McGlynn. The regional media's silence on the war is not really a finding of mine. The majority of my research has focused on national broadcast stations and Telegram. Paul Good of Carleton University researched regional newspapers. And he discovered that the war, obviously, they call it a special military operation, did not come up very much in the local news. They obviously tried to avoid it. I recently completed a brief study in which I examined the topics covered in Russian media outlets and the programming most watched by Russians. Since October 2022, I've noticed a fascinating shift from political discussion programs to a wider variety of series, serially, and films. I have noticed that the news and current events are given less attention on television. Honestly, I don't think the Russians are happy with how the war has progressed so far. The Ukrainians' failure to greet the Russians as liberators is, to put it mildly, a source of considerable cognitive dissonance. There appears to be considerable avoidance as well. Because you'll need to figure out why the invasion of Ukraine is going so poorly if you're going to have to answer questions about it. To be fair, there isn't much of an upside for regular Russians to answer such questions. After gathering that data, they would need to act on it. Russians do not look forward to the prospect of finding answers or accepting them,